In the heart of Las Vegas, a beloved mother and cocktail waitress was brutally murdered in her own home. Behind the crime stood not a stranger, but her husband, a respected firefighter. Betrayal, obsession, and a shocking murder-for-hire plot. This is the story you'll never forget. Las Vegas, a city that never sleeps, is a place built on illusions, bright lights masking shadows, dreams colliding with despair. In September 2012, the vibrant desert city would be forced to confront a nightmare that shattered the lives of everyone connected to Shauna Taifeh, a woman known not for notoriety, but for her warmth, resilience, and determination to provide for her young daughter. Her murder was not just an isolated act of violence, but a carefully calculated crime that revealed the darkest depths of jealousy, control, and obsession. Shauna Taifeh was 46 years old, a cocktail waitress at the upscale Palms Casino Resort. To the countless patrons she served, she was the woman with the bright smile and sharp wit, a professional who carried herself with poise in a world defined by neon glitz and late nights. To her friends and family, she was far more than that. Shauna was described as fiercely devoted to her little girl, a single mother in spirit even before the paperwork for divorce from her husband was finalized. She worked long, demanding shifts but always found time for school runs, bedtime stories, and the small rituals that anchored her daughter's sense of safety and love. Beneath the surface of her vibrant social personality, Shauna's private life had grown more turbulent. Her marriage to George Taifeh, a well-respected firefighter in Las Vegas, had become increasingly toxic. When they first met, George's career seemed noble and steady, offering the kind of security many women would value. For a time, they had what looked like a solid marriage. Friends recalled family gatherings, shared trips, and moments of genuine affection. But over the years, cracks began to show, cracks that widened with every argument about money, every controlling glance, every spike of jealousy from George whenever Shauna showed independence. By 2012, the marriage had disintegrated beyond repair. Shauna wanted a divorce. She wanted freedom from the constant tension, the cycle of mistrust, and the controlling behavior that made her feel suffocated. George, however, was not prepared to let go. Friends of Shauna recalled how she would voice her fears that her husband's jealousy could turn dangerous, though even she did not anticipate the brutal lengths he might go to. Still, the separation was official in all but paperwork, and the custody of their 8-year-old daughter was shared. Shauna was eager to move forward, to reclaim her life and build a future for herself and her child, without the shadow of George's bitterness looming over her. The final week of September began like so many others for Shauna. She was balancing late-night shifts at the Palms with school schedules and the demands of daily life. But George's resentment was building into something deadly. To the outside world, he remained the disciplined firefighter, the man trusted to run toward flames when others ran away. Yet, behind closed doors he was unraveling, plotting in silence, convinced that if he couldn't control Shauna in life, he would make sure she never truly escaped him. Enter Noel Stevens, a drifter who had long been a fixture in the rougher corners of Las Vegas. Homeless and struggling with addiction, Noel was a man many passed without a second glance. But George saw in him an opportunity. In Stevens, George found someone vulnerable, someone he could manipulate with promises of money, alcohol, and companionship. To Stevens, the firefighter seemed like a friend, a man who offered small kindnesses in exchange for loyalty. That loyalty, however, would soon be twisted into complicity in one of the most horrifying murders the city had ever seen. Surveillance footage later revealed the extent of their connection. George and Noel were seen together at local stores, purchasing tools and supplies. One of those items was a hammer, an object that, in George's mind, would become the instrument of finality in his collapsing marriage. For investigators later piecing together the timeline, the footage would prove critical. But at the time, it was just another anonymous transaction in a city teeming with countless lives. On September 29, 2012, Shauna's apartment complex was quiet in the early morning hours. Neighbors recalled no sounds of struggle that could penetrate the walls, no cries for help that reached their ears. Inside her apartment, Shauna was ambushed in a scene of unimaginable brutality. She was struck more than 20 times with the hammer, her life extinguished in an act of violence so savage that even seasoned detectives would later describe the crime scene as haunting. When Shauna failed to show up for an appointment, concerns were raised, and her body was discovered. News of her death spread quickly, devastating her colleagues at the Palms, her friends, and above all, her daughter, who could never fully comprehend why her mother wasn't coming home again. For those who loved her, the reality was unbearable. For investigators, the sheer ferocity of the crime suggested something far more personal than a burglary gone wrong. Detectives immediately began examining Shauna's life. The failed marriage stood out as a potential source of conflict. George's behavior in the aftermath of the murder also raised questions. Though outwardly shocked, his responses seemed calculated, as though he were performing rather than grieving. Then, investigators uncovered the link between George and Noelle Stevens. Phone records told a damning story. Repeated contact between the firefighter and the homeless man in the days leading up to Shauna's murder. Witnesses came forward recalling the odd friendship between the two men, a relationship that made little sense until viewed through the lens of conspiracy. As the net tightened, Stevens was brought in for questioning. Faced with mounting evidence, he broke. In a confession that left even hardened officers stunned, he admitted that George had orchestrated the killing. George, he explained, was consumed by anger, jealousy, and fear of losing money in the divorce. He painted a portrait of a man who could fight fires with courage but could not endure the idea of losing control over his wife. Stevens admitted he had been lured into the act by George's manipulations, his vulnerabilities exploited until he became the willing hand to George's murderous intent. With the confession secured and physical evidence linking George to the plot, investigators knew they had uncovered the truth. Yet the story was far from over. As detectives prepared to arrest George Taife, the firefighter was already planning his own escape. He would not face accountability quietly, and his next act would take him into the mountains outside Las Vegas in a desperate attempt to evade justice. By the time the prosecution rested, the story was undeniable. George Taife had orchestrated the murder of his wife. Noelle Stevens had been the weapon, but George had been the mind. Together, they destroyed a life that had been filled with promise, leaving a young girl to grow up with the knowledge that the murder of Shauna Taife was not just a crime of passion. It was a crime of calculation, a crime of manipulation, and a crime that exposed how obsession, when left unchecked, can corrode even the most disciplined of men. The city of Las Vegas, used to spectacle and illusion, now found itself staring into the raw truth of human darkness. And for Shauna's daughter, the world she once knew was shattered forever. As investigators tightened their focus, George Taife was no longer the respected firefighter who had served the city bravely. He was now the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. His carefully built image began to unravel with each piece of evidence uncovered. The man who once stood as a symbol of strength in emergencies was revealed to be consumed by weakness, jealousy, and rage. To detectives, the puzzle was almost complete, but George himself was not yet ready to surrender to the inevitable. The confession of Noelle Stevens was damning. When detectives first confronted him, Stevens was nervous and twitchy, a man used to the periphery of society, and used to the blinding glare of interrogation lights. Yet when the questions pressed harder, when detectives presented him with surveillance footage of him walking into stores alongside George, and when they showed him the hammer purchased just days before the murder, Stevens broke down. His words spilled out like a flood, unraveling the plot in chilling detail. George had not only befriended him, but also groomed him, offering small comforts and companionship in exchange for trust. George, he said, promised money and alcohol, painting the act as a favor that would settle his personal turmoil. Stevens described George as methodical, calculating, and above all, obsessed with the idea that Shauna could not be allowed to move forward with her life without him. With the confession came a clearer picture of the crime itself. On that September morning, Stevens had entered Shauna's apartment, armed with the hammer that George had helped him purchase. The attack was swift, brutal, and merciless. Shauna fought, but she was no match for the onslaught. More than 20 blows rained down on her, each strike tearing away at the life of a woman whose only crime was seeking freedom from a broken marriage. Stevens admitted that as he delivered the fatal blows, George was not physically there, but his influence was present in every swing of the weapon. The murder was his design, carried out through the hands of a man too lost to resist. Detectives had the confession, but they needed to ensure their case was airtight. Phone records confirmed multiple calls between George and Stevens in the days before and after the murder. Surveillance cameras captured them together. Bank records showed George's financial entanglements, including the pressure he felt from the impending divorce. Piece by piece, the facade of the heroic firefighter crumbled, replaced by the portrait of a man consumed by fear and control. News of Shauna's death spread quickly through Las Vegas, but as whispers of George's suspected involvement began circulating, shock deepened. How could a man sworn to save lives orchestrate the brutal death of his own wife? Among his colleagues at the fire department, disbelief was palpable. They had fought alongside him in burning buildings, trusted him with their lives, and yet here he was, accused of betraying the most sacred bond of all family. For Shauna's friends, the suspicion only confirmed the unease they had felt for years. They remembered her stories of his jealousy, his controlling behavior, and his refusal to accept the marriage's end. As detectives closed in, George made his move. Realizing the weight of the evidence and the inevitability of his arrest, he fled. Driving into the rugged mountains outside Las Vegas, he attempted to outrun not only the law but also the consequences of his own choices. His car sped along winding roads until it finally crashed in a violent wreck. It was not merely an accident, it was a suicide attempt. Investigators would later conclude that George intended to end his life before he could be forced to face justice. The crash left him badly injured, but not dead. Instead of escape, George found himself under guard in a hospital bed, his body broken, his plan in ruins. For Shauna's family, the days following the arrest were a mix of grief and grim relief. Grief because nothing could bring her back. Relief because at last the truth was emerging, and those responsible for her death were being held accountable. Shauna's daughter, only 8 years old, was left in the care of relatives, too young to fully understand why her world had collapsed so suddenly. The innocence of her childhood was stolen the moment her mother's life was taken and her father was branded a murderer. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced the task of laying out George's meticulous planning and Stevens's role as the instrument of the crime. The courtroom would become the stage where every detail of George's obsession was exposed. Jurors would hear how he stalked Shauna's life even after their separation, how he monitored her movements, and how he refused to accept her desire for independence. They would see the evidence of his purchases with Stevens, the calls that mapped out their coordination, and the confession that tied it all together. George's defense attempted to distance him from the act itself. They painted Stevens as unreliable, a drifter with nothing to lose, someone who might have acted on his own. But prosecutors countered with the mountain of evidence: Stevens's detailed confession, the surveillance footage, and the undeniable motive rooted in George's fear of financial loss and personal rejection. This was not a random crime of opportunity, it was a calculated conspiracy born of resentment. Throughout the proceedings, Shauna's presence was felt in every testimony. Friends and co-workers described her as a woman full of life, someone who deserved a future free from fear. Her daughter's absence from the courtroom was equally powerful, a silent reminder of what had been lost. George, sitting in the defendant's chair, showed little of the heroism once associated with his uniform. He was hollow, defeated, and stripped of the respect he had once commanded. The city of Las Vegas, accustomed to stories of excess and spectacle, found itself riveted by the intimate tragedy unfolding in its courts. This was not a headline about gamblers or celebrities, but about ordinary people destroyed by extraordinary violence. The case struck a nerve because it exposed how even in the heart of a city defined by bright lights, darkness could fester inside a home until it consumed everything. Her mother had been murdered at the hands of her father's jealousy. The verdict was yet to come, but in the court of public opinion, George was already guilty. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession unshakable, and the motive chillingly clear. Still, the trial was only one step in delivering justice for Shauna. The final chapter would unfold in sentencing, when the full weight of the law would determine George's fate and seal the legacy of his choices. The trial of George Taillefer became a grim spectacle, one that exposed the darkest layers of a marriage and the depths of obsession that had led to murder. In the courtroom, the image of George as a respected firefighter, a man who once ran into burning buildings to save lives, was shattered. What remained was a portrait of a husband who could not accept the loss of control, who valued power and pride over the sanctity of his family. Every detail revealed in court was like peeling back another layer of a facade, leaving jurors and spectators stunned by the cold, deliberate planning behind Shauna's death. Prosecutors painted George as the architect of the crime. They walked jurors through the weeks of preparation, showing the surveillance footage of him and Noelle Stevens purchasing items, including the hammer that would end Shauna's life. They laid out the phone records that proved repeated contact between the two men before and after the murder. They reminded jurors of Stevens's chilling confession, where he described how George had groomed and manipulated him into becoming the executioner of his plan. Each piece of evidence was meticulously tied to the next, creating a chain that led unavoidably back to George. The defense attempted to challenge Stevens's credibility, portraying him as an unreliable witness whose life on the streets and struggle with addiction made him untrustworthy. They suggested that Stevens might have acted alone, motivated by desperation rather than George's orders. But the weight of evidence was far too heavy. The surveillance videos did not lie. The phone calls, the shared purchases, the consistent timeline, all of it aligned perfectly with Stevens's account. George's efforts to distance himself from the act collapsed under the sheer volume of proof. Witnesses for the prosecution described Shauna as a woman who wanted nothing more than to build a safe, happy life for her daughter. Friends spoke of her laughter, her dedication, and her resilience. Co-workers from the Palms Casino painted a picture of a woman who carried herself with grace even while juggling the pressures of single motherhood and the demands of late-night shifts. Their testimonies underscored the tragedy of her death. She was not just a victim, but a life full of promise cut short. Shauna's family sat through the proceedings, forced to relive the horror of her final moments as the prosecution detailed the brutality of her murder. The autopsy revealed the savagery of the attack, with more than 20 hammer blows leaving devastating injuries. Each detail brought fresh grief to those who loved her, but also hardened their resolve to see justice served. For her daughter, too young to attend, her absence spoke louder than any words. The child had been robbed of both parents, her mother murdered, her father transformed into her mother's killer. As the trial neared its end, George remained stoic, rarely showing emotion. His silence, once seen as the discipline of a firefighter accustomed to crisis, now came across as chilling detachment. He listened as the prosecution delivered its closing arguments, reminding jurors that this was not a crime of impulse but of calculation. George had time to reflect, to reconsider, to stop. Yet he chose to push forward, to turn his resentment into murder. The defense urged the jury to consider doubt, but in the faces of the jurors it was clear, doubt had no place here. The verdict was delivered after hours of deliberation. George Taillefer was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and burglary. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and sorrow. Shauna's family wept, holding each other tightly, knowing that though justice had been served, the wound of her absence would never fully heal. George sat motionless, his fate sealed, stripped of the uniform that once defined him, left only with the legacy of his crime. At sentencing, the weight of his actions came crashing down in the form of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, confined not just by concrete walls but by the memory of the life he destroyed. Noelle Stevens, who had pleaded guilty for his role, received a lengthy prison sentence as well. His confession, though instrumental in securing George's conviction, could not erase the fact that his hands had carried out the act. Together, their fates were sealed, intertwined by the darkness of a crime that neither could escape. The city of Las Vegas moved on in the way cities often do, but the memory of the case lingered. For those who followed the trial, it was a chilling reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. George was not an outsider, not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a firefighter, a husband, a father. He was someone trusted by his community, and yet he orchestrated one of the most brutal murders the city had ever seen. The betrayal cut deeper because it came from within the circle of family and trust. For Shauna's daughter, the years ahead would be marked by resilience and sorrow. She would grow up with the memory of a mother who loved her deeply and the shadow of a father who took that love away. Friends and relatives rallied around her, determined to shield her from the harshest realities of her parents' story. Still, the truth could never be erased. The child became the living reminder of what had been lost. A family destroyed by the corrosive power of jealousy and control. The legacy of Shauna's life endured in the memories of those who loved her. Friends continued to speak of her kindness, her laughter, and the joy she brought into their lives. Colleagues remembered the dedication she brought to her work, even in the long hours of the casino floor. Her family clung to the memories of holidays, birthdays, and the countless everyday moments that made her life meaningful. In telling her story, they ensured that she would be remembered not as a victim of brutality, but as a woman who lived with strength and love until her final day. The story of Shauna Taifeh is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of a marriage that unraveled under the weight of control, of a man who could not accept change, and of a plan that turned into a nightmare. It is the story of how obsession can erode humanity, twisting love into ownership and care into cruelty. And it is the story of a community that, once again, learned that the worst horrors do not always come from strangers in the night, but from those closest to us. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded, what remained was the silence of absence. Shauna's laughter no longer filled her daughter's world. Her presence no longer lit up the lives of her friends. Yet through justice there was a measure of closure. The man who thought he could control her fate was locked away, left to confront the emptiness of his choices. And those who loved Shauna carried her memory forward, determined that her story would be told not just as a crime, but as a life that mattered, a life that deserved so much more. A respected pastor, a devoted mother, and a secret affair that spiraled into betrayal and murder. When 37-year-old Marie Carlson vanished in Florida, the truth lay buried for years. This is the chilling story of faith twisted by deception, and how love turned deadly in the shadows. On an ordinary October morning in 2011, life in the coastal city of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, seemed as calm as ever. The quiet neighborhoods along the Emerald Coast were a world away from the chaos of big cities, and for many families, the area represented safety and stability. But for 37-year-old Marie Jane Carlson, the peace of her surroundings did little to reflect the storm brewing in her private life. Known by her friends and family as a compassionate, intelligent, and deeply spiritual woman, Marie had always been the type of person people were drawn to. She was caring, engaging, and had a natural warmth that made her memorable to everyone she met. Her ties to Canada, through family and earlier chapters of her life, gave her an international perspective and a sense of independence that made her stand out in her Florida community. But while Marie's life appeared steady on the outside, the choices she made in the months before her disappearance would entangle her in a dangerous web of secrecy, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. Marie had become involved with a man who outwardly embodied respectability and morality. Pastor James Flanders was a leader within his church, a man who commanded respect from his congregation and projected an image of spiritual authority. He preached about morality, family values, and faithfulness, but his private actions painted a very different picture. Marie and James developed a close relationship that crossed boundaries. What began as an emotional connection evolved into a physical and intimate affair, one that carried immense consequences for both of them. James was married, and his wife Tanya Flanders had already endured strain in their relationship. The affair with Marie not only threatened his marriage but also his position in the church and the community that revered him. To those around him, James was a shepherd guiding his flock, but behind closed doors he was a man leading a double life. For Marie, the relationship was complicated. She believed she loved James and trusted him, perhaps more than she should have. When she discovered she was pregnant with his child, her life shifted dramatically. This development added an overwhelming layer of pressure to their secret affair. For Marie, it was both a moment of vulnerability and a reason to hope. She dreamed of a future where James might choose her and their child over the life he was desperately clinging to. But for James, the pregnancy was a ticking time bomb that threatened to unravel everything he had built. His reputation as a pastor, the stability of his marriage, and the carefully cultivated image of a faithful family man stood on the edge of collapse. Exposure meant humiliation, disgrace, and possibly the end of his career and community standing. Those who knew Marie sensed something was wrong in the days leading up to her disappearance. While she had her share of struggles, she was not the type of woman to suddenly abandon her daughter or cut ties with loved ones. On the morning she vanished, she left behind her infant child, personal belongings, and car. To investigators, it immediately raised alarms. Mothers rarely walk away from their children, and Marie's family quickly insisted that something terrible must have happened. At first, there were no clear signs of foul play, no forced entry, no violent struggle. But absence itself became the most damning clue. Marie was gone without explanation, and the longer she stayed missing, the more urgent the questions became. Attention naturally turned toward James Flanders. He was one of the last people known to have close contact with Marie, and his involvement in her life was no longer a secret. Rumors spread quickly through their community. How could a pastor, a man who preached faithfulness and truth, be tied to the sudden disappearance of a woman with whom he had been having an affair? Yet, despite the whispers and suspicions, concrete evidence was lacking. Without a body, without a confession, investigators faced enormous challenges in proving any crime had taken place at all. The case lingered in uncertainty, frustrating Marie's family and friends who knew in their hearts that she had not left voluntarily. Meanwhile, James carried on with his life, maintaining his position in the church, delivering sermons, and attempting to appear as though nothing had changed. For the congregation, it was a test of faith. Many were unaware of the darkness that was hidden behind their pastor's words. For Tanya, James's wife, the betrayal was undeniable. Though she remained by his side, her world had been upended. Her husband's infidelity and the consequences of his secret relationship with Marie could not be erased, even if she was not publicly addressing the scandal. Tanya was both a silent victim of her husband's choices and, in the eyes of some, a silent witness to the unraveling truth. Her marriage was fractured, her trust shattered, and her life altered in ways she could never fully escape. The disappearance of Marie Carlson quickly gained media attention, not just locally but also in Canadian outlets because of her family connections. The story was as sensational as it was heartbreaking. A pastor caught in a scandalous affair, a woman gone without a trace, and a young child left motherless. To the outside world, it seemed like the pieces of a tragic puzzle were sitting in plain sight, but the picture could not yet be completed. Investigators worked tirelessly, questioning witnesses, retracing Marie's last known steps, and looking for inconsistencies in James's statements. But each lead seemed to fade before reaching resolution. Time passed, and the case grew cold, lingering in a painful limbo where suspicion lived but justice seemed unreachable. As months turned into years, the absence of answers left Marie's loved ones broken. Her family mourned without closure, trapped between hope and despair. Every birthday, every holiday passed as a reminder of her absence. Her daughter grew up without a mother, and the community was left to speculate about what had really happened in the final hours before Marie vanished. All the while, James Flanders continued to preach, the shadow of suspicion trailing him, but not enough to bring him down. To those who still believed in him, he was a flawed man trying to move forward. To those who doubted him, he was a dangerous hypocrite hiding behind the shield of his faith. The early chapter of Marie Carlson's story was one of promise, trust, and love that tragically transformed into secrecy, betrayal, and disappearance. The unanswered questions hung heavy over Fort Walton Beach, creating a story that was far from over. Investigators knew that one day the truth would surface, because in cases like these, secrets rarely stay buried forever. The days following Marie Carlson's disappearance quickly turned into weeks, and then months. For investigators, the absence of hard evidence made progress slow and frustrating. They combed through Marie's home, her car, and her digital records, searching for any sign that she had left of her own accord. But nothing aligned with the theory that she had chosen to walk away from her life. Her car sat untouched, her identification and personal items remained behind, and most telling of all, her infant daughter had been left in the care of others. For those who knew Marie best, that detail was impossible to reconcile. She was devoted to her child, and the thought of abandoning her was inconceivable. The community's initial response was to rally around the search. Flyers were distributed, vigils were held, and Marie's picture was circulated widely. Yet as time stretched on without answers, frustration and suspicion deepened. Rumors swirled about the complicated relationship between Marie and Pastor James Flanders, and soon his carefully cultivated image began to crack. Behind the pulpit, James still spoke about righteousness, commitment, and truth, but the whispers about his affair with Marie echoed through the congregation. To the public eye, he seemed unshaken, but behind closed doors, investigators believed the pressure was mounting. Detectives brought James in for questioning multiple times, scrutinizing his movements in the days leading up to Marie's disappearance. They asked him to recount his last interactions with her, but his answers lacked the clarity investigators hoped for. He insisted he had no knowledge of where she might have gone, portraying himself as concerned but powerless to help. His wife, Tanya, stood by him publicly, though their strained expressions during interviews told another story. The fact that Tanya was aware of her husband's infidelity added another layer of tension to the investigation. If James was guilty, how much did Tanya know? And if she knew, was she protecting him out of loyalty, fear, or denial? As the case dragged on, leads went cold, and evidence remained elusive. For Marie's family, this period was agonizing. They pleaded for answers, begged for tips, and never stopped pushing investigators to pursue the truth. Each holiday passed like a wound reopened, every unanswered phone call reminding them of the void her absence created. Her daughter, too young to understand, grew up without her mother, her earliest memories shaped by a loss she could not yet comprehend. The years that followed turned the case into a haunting mystery in Fort Walton Beach. Investigators continued to monitor James, never fully convinced of his innocence but unable to prove his guilt. People who once respected him began to keep their distance, while others clung to the belief that their pastor could not be capable of such a crime. The duality of James's life, his public role as a spiritual leader and his private life of secrets, was at the heart of the unease surrounding the case. Marie's story was fading from headlines, but for detectives, it was far from forgotten. By 2015, 4 years had passed since Marie's disappearance. Advances in investigative techniques and renewed attention on cold cases pushed detectives to revisit her file. The inconsistencies in James Flanders' statements stood out more sharply than ever before. They approached him again, this time applying greater pressure and probing deeper into his story. James, once confident in his ability to maintain his facade, began to crack. The weight of his secret had been heavy, and after years of evading the truth, his resolve weakened. In a pivotal moment, James Flanders confessed. He admitted that during an argument with Marie, things escalated beyond control. He claimed he had not planned her death, but in the heat of the confrontation, he strangled her. His explanation painted the crime as spontaneous rather than premeditated. But to Marie's loved ones, it made little difference. She was gone, and the man she trusted had taken her life. What was perhaps most chilling was the fact that James had continued to preach and lead his congregation while carrying the weight of this deadly secret. He buried Marie's body in the backyard of a house he once lived in, concealing her remains while delivering sermons about truth and morality. The revelation shattered whatever illusions remained. For the community, the betrayal cut deep. A man who had stood as a moral compass had been exposed as a killer. For Tanya, the confession was devastating, though not entirely surprising. Her marriage, already scarred by infidelity, now carried the stain of murder. She had stood by James publicly, perhaps hoping against hope that the rumors were wrong. Now she was faced with the undeniable truth. Her husband was guilty of the very sins he condemned in others, and the life they had built together was destroyed. The discovery of Marie's remains brought a measure of closure to her family, but it was closure wrapped in anguish. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew the truth, but knowing also meant confronting the horror of what had happened. Marie had placed her trust in James, believing his promises and his faith, and that trust had cost her everything. Her family mourned not just her death, but the betrayal that surrounded it. They struggled to reconcile the image of the man responsible, a pastor who spoke of love and forgiveness even as he hid the evidence of his crime. The legal process moved forward, though not without controversy. James Flanders was charged, and in the end, sentenced to 15 years in prison for manslaughter. To many, the punishment felt woefully inadequate for the magnitude of his actions. 15 years for a life taken, 15 years for a child robbed of her mother, and 15 years for the years of lies and deception that followed. Critics of the sentence argued that the justice system had failed Marie, that James's confession had allowed him to escape the full weight of accountability. But for others, the sentence represented at least some measure of justice, a guarantee that James would no longer stand before a congregation or portray himself as a man of integrity. The years of uncertainty, the pain of unanswered questions, and the final revelation left a lasting mark on everyone connected to the case. Marie's daughter would grow up knowing the truth about her mother's fate, her story forever tied to the choices of a man who had preached faith but practiced betrayal. Tanya would carry the scars of her husband's actions, forced to reconcile the life she thought she had with the one shattered by his lies. And the community of Fort Walton Beach would remember the case as a sobering reminder that evil can hide behind even the most trusted roles. Marie Carlson's disappearance had begun as a mystery, but by the time the truth came out, it had become a story about the dangers of secrecy, the fragility of trust, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. The crime shocked a community, destroyed a family, and silenced a woman whose only mistake was believing in the wrong man. And though James Flanders eventually admitted to his crime, his confession could never undo the years of suffering his silence had caused. The courtroom was quiet when James Flanders finally stood before the judge, his once commanding presence as a pastor reduced to the weary figure of a man stripped of his reputation. For years, he had carried the weight of Marie Carlson's death in silence, delivering sermons on faith and morality while hiding the darkest secret of his life. Now, the mask had slipped completely, and the world could finally see him for what he was. The community that once trusted him watched in disbelief as the details of his confession became public. He admitted to strangling Marie during an argument and burying her body in a backyard. He admitted to continuing life as though nothing had happened, raising his own family and maintaining his church position, even as Marie's loved ones searched desperately for answers. The betrayal was staggering. Marie's family filled the courtroom, their faces etched with grief that had been compounded by 4 years of uncertainty. They had prayed for closure, hoped for justice, and endured endless nights of wondering whether she was alive or dead. Now, at last, they had an answer, though it was one that no family ever wants to hear. They listened to James's words, his explanations, and his apologies, but no amount of justification could ease the pain. They thought of Marie's infant daughter, left behind to grow up without the warmth of her mother's love. They thought of the woman who had brought light to their lives and how that light had been cruelly extinguished. For them, the trial was not just about punishment. It was about ensuring that Marie's story was not forgotten. The sentence, when it came, left many stunned. 15 years in prison for manslaughter. To Marie's family, it felt like a fraction of the justice she deserved. How could a life so brutally taken, a secret so carefully hidden, and a betrayal so deep result in only a decade and a half behind bars? For some, it felt as though James had once again escaped full accountability. Yet, for others, it was at least a measure of justice, an acknowledgement that he was guilty and would face time away from the life he once manipulated so carefully. The legal outcome sparked debate, with critics arguing that the system had failed Marie, while others emphasized that without his confession, the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely. The aftermath of the trial rippled through Fort Walton Beach. Parishioners who had once looked to James for guidance were forced to confront the reality that their pastor was a killer. Trust, once freely given, was shattered. The church community splintered, some leaving in disillusionment, others struggling to reconcile the man they had followed with the crime he committed. For Tanya, his wife, the fallout was even more personal. She had endured his infidelity, borne the shame of public scandal, and now faced the world knowing her husband had taken another woman's life. Though she had not been charged with any crime, her life was irreparably damaged, defined by the choices James had made. Marie's story also gained wider attention beyond Florida, particularly in Canada, where her family ties connected her tragedy to another community thousands of miles away. Canadian media covered the developments closely, highlighting not only the crime but the human story behind it. To them, Marie was not just a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, and a friend whose absence left a void across borders. Her family, still grieving, used her story as a reminder of the dangers of blind trust and the devastating consequences of secrecy. For investigators, the case became a study in persistence. Without their refusal to let the case fade into obscurity, Marie's remains might never have been found, and James might never have confessed. Their work demonstrated the importance of revisiting cold cases, of re-examining evidence, and of never giving up on the pursuit of justice for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. For the detectives who had spent years haunted by unanswered questions, James's confession was a bittersweet victory. They had solved the case, but the outcome could never restore what had been lost. As James began his prison sentence, the focus shifted to the future of Marie's daughter. She was the most innocent victim of all, left to navigate life without her mother and with the knowledge of what her father had done. For her, the truth was both a burden and a key to understanding the past. The story she would grow up hearing was not one of a simple disappearance but of betrayal, violence, and survival. Those who loved Marie vowed to keep her memory alive, to ensure her daughter knew the kind of woman her mother was: kind, loving, and undeserving of the fate that befell her. In the years that followed, Marie's case continued to resonate as a cautionary tale. Documentaries, news specials, and true crime discussions revisited her story, exploring not only the crime itself but the broader themes it represented. The danger of hidden lives, the hypocrisy of leaders who fail to live by their teachings, and the vulnerability of women who place their trust in the wrong people. Marie's death highlighted how fear of exposure, pride, and shame can lead individuals to commit unthinkable acts. Her story was not just about one man's crime, but about the broader human capacity for deception and the devastating price others pay for it. For James Flanders, prison walls replaced the pulpit, and the respect he once commanded was gone forever. His name, once associated with faith and guidance, became synonymous with betrayal and murder. His sermons on morality stood as bitter reminders of his hypocrisy, echoing hollow against the reality of his actions. Behind bars, he faced the consequences of years spent lying, hiding, and manipulating. For the community he left behind, his downfall served as a painful reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that even those who seem most righteous can harbor darkness within. Marie Carlson's legacy, however, endured beyond the crime that ended her life. To her family and friends, she remained more than a victim. They remembered her smile, her compassion, and her unwavering love for her daughter. They remembered the warmth she brought into their lives and the dreams she carried for the future. Though her story ended in tragedy, her life continued to inspire those who knew her to speak out, to demand justice, and to never let secrecy silence the truth. The final chapter of Marie Carlson's story is not written in the courtroom or the prison cell, but in the lives of those she touched. Her daughter carries her spirit forward, her family keeps her memory alive, and her story continues to be told as a reminder of the fragile line between trust and betrayal. The world may remember her as the woman who vanished, the woman whose life was stolen by a man who feared the truth, but those who loved her remember her as so much more. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a soul who deserved better. And though justice may never have felt complete, the truth, at least, was no longer hidden in the shadows. In October 2016, a vibrant young woman's life was stolen in her own home, not by a stranger, but by someone she once loved. This chilling case exposes the terrifying reality of obsession, stalking, and a system's failure. Alice Ruggles' story will haunt you and demand your full attention. In the autumn of 2016, the town of Gateshead in the northeast of England was filled with the kind of ordinary rhythms that marked most days in a quiet community. But beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing in the life of a young woman named Alice Ruggles, a storm that would end in tragedy and leave a nation questioning how something so preventable could have gone so far. At just 24 years old, Alice was everything one might imagine when picturing someone with her entire life ahead of her. She was bright, funny, independent, and known to everyone around her as someone who could light up a room simply by being in it. Friends described her as the sort of person who left a mark, never loud or demanding attention, but always present with warmth, humor, and kindness. Alice had studied at Northumbria University and earned her degree with pride. After graduation, she secured a job working for Sky in Newcastle, a role that allowed her to remain close to her friends and family while building a career for herself. She lived in a shared flat, enjoying the balance of independence and companionship. Her days were filled with the normal pursuits of a young professional: work, friends, family visits, and the occasional nights out. From the outside, her life appeared steady and bright. But inside that seemingly ordinary existence, an insidious presence was growing, one that would come to define her final months. That presence was Trimon Harry Dillon, a soldier serving with the Royal Regiment of Signals in the British Army, based at a barracks near Edinburgh. On the surface, Dillon projected an image of discipline and prestige. He wore his military career like armor, often boasting about his role and presenting himself as someone driven and ambitious. It was through mutual friends that Alice first encountered him. Like many who first met Dillon, she was intrigued by his confidence, the sense of purpose that came with his uniform, and the attention he lavished upon her. In the early stages, he seemed charismatic and eager to please. For a young woman like Alice, who valued kindness and connection, the relationship seemed promising at first. But charm, when built on deception, rarely lasts. As the weeks turned into months, Alice began to see another side of Dillon, a side that was darker, obsessive, and suffocating. He was jealous and controlling, monitoring her actions as though every moment of her life required his approval. His behavior shifted quickly from affection to interrogation. He would demand constant communication, question her interactions with others, and react with anger or suspicion if she failed to meet his expectations. Slowly, the joy of being in a relationship gave way to unease. Friends noticed it too. Those closest to Alice began to see how her usual vibrancy dimmed in Dillon's shadow. She was careful with her words, often anxious about how he might react to even the most innocent of choices. For someone as independent as Alice, the realization that her freedom was being chipped away was devastating. She eventually saw the truth. What she was experiencing wasn't love, it was control. She knew she had to walk away. Ending the relationship was never going to be simple. Dillon, consumed by a need for dominance, refused to let go. For him, rejection was not just painful, it was intolerable. He clung to her with a desperation that quickly grew into obsession. Where once he had showered her with attention, now he bombarded her with incessant calls and messages. If she didn't respond, he would try again and again, each time with greater urgency, as if sheer persistence could bend her will. He hacked into her social media accounts, determined to monitor her every move. He sent unwanted gifts to her flat, a chilling reminder that he knew exactly where she lived. For Alice, it became a nightmare she could not escape. She blocked his numbers, but he found new ways to reach her. She changed her routines, but he seemed to anticipate them. What had begun as a relationship had turned into a campaign of harassment, one that left her constantly on edge. She confided in her friends, who urged her to report his behavior to the police. And eventually she did. She contacted Northumbria Police, detailing the harassment and the overwhelming fear she felt. But when officers assessed her case, they classified it as harassment rather than stalking. That distinction, subtle as it might sound, had grave consequences. Harassment suggested inconvenience and annoyance, Stalking suggested danger. This misclassification meant that the urgency of her situation was downplayed. For Alice, the calls to police brought little reassurance. She was told to keep records of his messages, to monitor the behavior, to wait. Yet with each day, the shadow over her life grew darker. Dylan's obsession wasn't subsiding, it was escalating. He felt entitled to her time, her attention, and ultimately her existence. And in his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one else could. Despite the fear she lived with, Alice tried to reclaim her life. She reconnected with friends, went out again, and even began to see someone new. It was a brave attempt to step forward, to prove to herself and to Dylan that he no longer had control over her. But to Dylan, her newfound happiness was nothing short of betrayal. The thought of Alice smiling, laughing, or loving another person ignited a rage in him that consumed his every thought. As the weeks passed, Dylan's actions became more desperate. He would drive from Edinburgh to Gateshead, watching her flat from a distance, his mind unraveling further with every glimpse of her moving on. Alice didn't know the full extent of how far his obsession had taken him, but she felt the weight of his presence pressing in. She told her family about her fears, admitted that she worried what he might do, and yet, she carried on, refusing to let him dictate every part of her life. It was a strength born of determination, but it placed her directly in harm's way. Dylan's obsession had crossed into a territory that was no longer about winning her back. It was about control, revenge, and possession. The stage was being set for the tragic night when his desperation would finally boil over into violence, and the ordinary calm of Gateshead would be shattered forever. By the early days of October 2016, Alice's life had become a balancing act between holding onto her sense of normality and managing the fear that Dylan's presence cast over her. On one hand, she was a young woman making plans with friends, working at a job she enjoyed, and looking toward the future. On the other, she was the unwilling focus of a man who refused to accept that their relationship was over. The tension between these two realities weighed heavily on her, though she worked hard not to let it dominate her outward personality. To those who knew her best, however, the worry was clear. They saw how she jumped at unexpected noises, how her phone's constant notifications left her anxious, and how the thought of Dylan showing up unexpectedly was never far from her mind. Dylan's obsession was not the erratic behavior of a man who moved on and off. It was systematic, persistent, and calculated. He contacted Alice again and again, switching numbers, creating fake accounts, even attempting to infiltrate her online world to track her movements. In the weeks after their breakup, his messages shifted tone, sometimes pleading for another chance, other times laced with anger and blame. When Alice ignored him, he escalated, sending gifts to her flat that she neither wanted nor welcomed. A bouquet of flowers, an unasked-for delivery, an item left as a reminder. All were designed to keep her from feeling safe in her own space. For Alice, these gestures did not read as affection but as intimidation. Each new attempt at contact reminded her that Dylan was never far, and that he was willing to cross boundaries to make his presence known. She had reached out to police for help, hoping for firm action that would make him stop. Yet the system offered her little more than a record of her complaint and advice to remain vigilant. This was not enough to ease her fears. Instead, it confirmed the unsettling reality that she was largely left to navigate this nightmare on her own. Her friends remained her strongest source of support. They reminded her constantly that none of this was her fault, that she had every right to walk away from Dylan, and that she deserved the freedom he was trying to strip from her. They stood by her as she took steps to block him, to report him, and to try to live life as normally as possible. Family visits brought her comfort too. Her parents and siblings, though deeply worried, encouraged her to trust her instincts and keep reaching out for help when she felt unsafe. Still, despite their reassurances, Alice carried the weight of knowing Dylan's behavior was becoming more unpredictable. Meanwhile, Dylan's own life was consumed by his fixation on Alice. At his barracks in Edinburgh, he was expected to maintain discipline and focus, yet much of his time and attention was directed toward plotting ways to reach her. His military career, once a point of pride, became a backdrop for his controlling behavior. He used his status to impress, to intimidate, and to justify his demands for loyalty. But behind the facade of the uniform, his thoughts revolved around one thing: regaining control over the woman who no longer wanted him. His pride could not bear the humiliation of rejection. To him, Alice moving on represented a loss he could not tolerate. The breaking point came when Alice began seeing someone new. It wasn't a grand romance, but the early stages of a connection that gave her hope for the future. For Alice, this was a symbol of moving forward, of proving to herself that Dylan no longer had a hold on her. But to Dylan, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The idea of her sharing her time, laughter, or affection with someone else was unbearable. In his mind, Alice belonged to him, and her decision to seek happiness elsewhere triggered a rage that only grew with each passing day. His communications became more menacing. Where once he had begged, he now demanded. Where once he had promised love, he now implied consequences. The tone of his obsession shifted from longing to revenge. He drove from Edinburgh to Gateshead more than once, parking near Alice's flat to watch from a distance. It was an act that brought him both twisted satisfaction and deeper frustration. He could see her life continuing without him, and that only sharpened his resolve to intervene. Alice sensed the danger. She spoke to those around her about her unease, acknowledging the fear that he might go further than unwanted messages or gifts. The thought that Dylan could appear in person was one she did not dismiss. Yet, she tried to keep moving, to avoid letting fear consume her completely. She focused on her job, her friends, and her new relationship, doing her best to reclaim the joy she had once felt in everyday moments. But Dylan's desperation was nearing its peak. On October 12, 2016, he set his final plan into motion. From his barracks in Edinburgh, he made the decision to drive to Gateshead. The journey was more than 2 hours, yet he drove with a chilling determination. Every mile brought him closer to the confrontation he had been building toward for weeks. In his mind, the narrative was simple. If he could not have Alice, he would make sure no one else could either. Alice spent that day in what seemed like an ordinary rhythm. She had been in touch with friends, spoke about plans for the coming days, and returned to her flat in the evening. To her flatmate, she seemed in relatively good spirits, though the undercurrent of worry about Dylan never truly disappeared. She tried to focus on the positives, to enjoy the normality of her surroundings, unaware that just hours later, her worst fears would manifest at her very doorstep. Dylan arrived in Gateshead under cover of night. He parked his vehicle and approached Alice's flat with deliberate precision. This was no spontaneous act, but one fueled by weeks of planning and obsession. He knew where she lived, how to get inside, and how to ensure that he could catch her unaware. For Alice, the safety of her home, the place she should have felt most secure, was about to be violated in the most horrifying way possible. As he reached the building, the night was quiet, the streets calm. No one passing by would have guessed the violence about to unfold. Dylan scaled the outside, climbing toward Alice's window. His determination was terrifying, his movements fueled by rage and entitlement. Alice, inside, had no way of knowing that the man she had tried so desperately to escape had now arrived with lethal intent. The nightmare that had haunted her for months was no longer a distant possibility. It was at her window, about to invade her world in the most violent and irreversible way. When Dylan climbed through Alice's window on the night of October 12, 2016, the last barrier between obsession and violence was crossed. For months he had stalked, harassed, and manipulated her. But this time he was not there to beg for attention or deliver unwanted gifts. He was there with a single purpose: to assert control one final time through an act of violence that would silence her forever. Alice, alone in her flat at the time, was suddenly face to face with the man she had tried so hard to escape. In those final moments, she must have realized that the fear she had spoken of to friends and police had become reality. Dylan attacked her with brutal ferocity, slitting her throat in an act of rage and possession. Within minutes, Alice's life was stolen, and the bright future she had dreamed of was extinguished by the hands of a man who could not accept rejection. The aftermath of the attack was chaos and despair. Alice's flatmate, alarmed by the silence and unable to reach her, alerted authorities. When police and emergency responders arrived, they were confronted with a horrific scene. Alice's body lay lifeless, the evidence of violence clear and devastating. The investigation that followed quickly identified Dylan as the prime suspect. His obsession had been well documented, through the messages, the unwanted visits, and Alice's own reports to the police. For detectives, the question was not who had committed the crime, but how he had managed to carry out such an attack despite the warning signs. Dylan was arrested and charged with Alice's murder. During questioning, he attempted to downplay his actions, portraying himself as a man misunderstood, even suggesting that Alice had provoked his behavior. But the overwhelming evidence told a different story. His digital footprint, his movements on the night of the murder, and the testimony of Alice's friends and family painted a clear picture of a man consumed by obsession and determined to exert control at any cost. The trial that followed in 2017 brought these details to light, exposing the chilling reality of Dylan's behavior and the system's failure to protect Alice from him. In court, the prosecution detailed how Dylan's campaign of stalking had escalated over time, moving from messages and surveillance to physical intrusion and, ultimately, murder. Witnesses described the fear Alice lived with in her final weeks, how she confided in those closest to her about her growing concern that Dylan might harm her. The jury heard about the times she reached out to police, hoping for stronger intervention, only to be met with responses that categorized her case as harassment rather than stalking. This distinction, small on paper, had monumental consequences in reality. By treating Dylan's actions as minor, the urgency to act decisively had been lost, leaving Alice vulnerable. Dylan's defense attempted to frame him as a man under emotional strain, someone who had acted in a moment of passion. But this was no crime of impulse. It was premeditated, deliberate, and executed with chilling determination. The journey from Edinburgh to Gateshead, the methodical entry through her window, and the sheer violence of the attack all pointed to an act planned in advance. The jury saw through his attempts at manipulation, recognizing the danger he posed not only to Alice but to society at large. In April 2017, Trymon Harry Dylan was convicted of the murder of Alice Ruggles. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow. For Alice's family, justice had been served, but no sentence could ever fill the void left by her death. The trial had exposed the devastating consequences of stalking, but it also raised critical questions about why more had not been done when Alice first sounded the alarm. In the years that followed, Alice's story became a rallying cry for change. Her family, determined that no one else should endure the same fate, established the Alice Ruggles Trust. The charity works to raise awareness about stalking, to educate police, schools, and communities about the warning signs, and to push for systemic reforms. Through their efforts, Alice's memory lives on, not only as a reminder of what was lost, but as a force for preventing future tragedies. The case also led to increased scrutiny of how stalking is handled in the UK. Training for police officers was expanded, and campaigns were launched to ensure that stalking is recognized as a crime rooted in control and obsession rather than simply annoyance. The narrative surrounding such behavior began to shift, acknowledging the real danger that victims face when stalkers are allowed to escalate unchecked. Alice's murder became a turning point, sparking conversations that continue to influence law enforcement and policy decisions today. For those who knew her personally, the loss remained immeasurable. Friends remembered her laughter, her generosity, and her ability to make people feel valued. Family members spoke of the milestones she would never reach, the moments stolen by an act of violence that should never have happened. The contrast between the light she brought into the world and the darkness of her death underscored the cruelty of the crime. Documentaries and news coverage of the case brought Alice's story to wider audiences, ensuring that her name would not be forgotten. Her death became more than a statistic. It became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked obsession and the need for society to take stalking seriously. Each retelling of her story served as both a tribute to her life and a warning of what can happen when red flags are ignored. Trymon Dylan remains behind bars, serving a sentence that reflects the brutality of his actions. Yet, Even in prison, his shadow lingers in the conversations about stalking, coercive control, and the failures of the system. His name is forever tied to a crime that stripped a young woman of her future, a crime that forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about how victims are protected or, too often, left unprotected. The murder of Alice Ruggles is remembered not just for its tragedy but for the lessons it imparts. It highlights the importance of listening to victims, of recognizing that obsessive behavior is not harmless but potentially lethal. It shows that behind every report of harassment or unwanted attention could be a life at risk. And it demonstrates that while justice after the fact is necessary, true prevention comes from intervention before the violence begins. As time passes, the memory of Alice continues to inspire change. Her trust works tirelessly to educate others, ensuring that her story does not fade into obscurity, but instead fuels efforts to protect those who might otherwise slip through the cracks. Though her life was cut short, her legacy endures, a legacy of awareness, advocacy, and the determination to stop stalking from claiming more lives. In Gateshead, where the quiet streets once bore witness to an unthinkable act, her memory lingers. Among her family and friends, her laughter echoes in stories told and retold, preserving the essence of who she was. And across the country, her name stands as a reminder that love should never come with fear, that obsession is not devotion, and that every warning sign deserves to be heard. Alice Ruggles was more than the victim of a crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman with dreams still ahead of her. Though her life ended in violence, the fight for change born from her tragedy continues to give her story meaning. And in that ongoing fight, Alice's voice, silenced on that October night, speaks louder than ever before.